I never thought my own daughter would be the one to leave me stranded at a Greyhound station in the middle of January with nothing but a thin jacket and an empty stomach. But there I was, 67 years old, standing outside the Pittsburgh Transportation Center, watching her taillights disappear into the grey morning like she couldn't get away fast enough. It had started 2 weeks earlier with a phone call that should have made me suspicious. My daughter Lee called me at my apartment in Millvale on a Tuesday evening, and her voice had that brightness to it, the kind she used to have when she was 12 and wanted something expensive for Christmas. "Dad," she said, "I've been thinking. You've been alone since you retired, and Kurt and I feel terrible about it. We want you to come stay with us for a while. Just for a month or so. Get you out of that apartment, get some good home cooking into you." I should have known better. Lee and I hadn't spent more than a long weekend together in 4 years, not since her mother passed. Since then, her life had become something I barely recognized. She'd married Kurt, who ran some kind of financial consulting business in Shadyside, and they'd moved into a house in Fox Chapel that had more square footage than the warehouse where I'd spent 30 years as a machinist. I knew she was embarrassed by me, though she'd never say it outright. I'd seen it in the way she laughed too loudly at her own explanations whenever she introduced me to her friends. The way she'd once asked me, gently but clearly, not to wear my Union jacket to her neighbor's barbecue. But I wanted to believe she meant it. I wanted to believe my daughter still needed her father for something other than obligation. The drive down should have been my first signal. Lee barely spoke. Kurt sat in the passenger seat scrolling through his phone the entire 2 hours, and Lee kept her eyes fixed on the interstate with that tight set to her jaw that I remembered from when she was a teenager and had already decided something but hadn't told me yet. I tried asking about my grandson, little Emmett, 5 years old, and the best thing that had come out of their marriage as far as I was concerned. One-word answers. Fine. Good. Growing. We pulled into Pittsburgh on a Thursday morning, and instead of taking the Fox Chapel exit, Lee merged onto a different highway. I figured she needed to stop somewhere first, but then she pulled into the Greyhound terminal on Liberty Avenue and put the car in park. "I need to run an errand, and I figured you could wait inside," she said, not looking at me. "It's warm in there. Dad, can you grab your bag from the trunk?" I climbed out and pulled my duffel from the back. The same bag I'd packed for a month-long visit. When I straightened up and turned around, Lee had rolled her window down just enough to say, "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am." Then she drove away. I stood there for a full 30 seconds before I understood what had just happened. My wallet was in my coat pocket, which was in that trunk. I'd taken it off in the car because the heater was running hot. My phone was in the same coat. My reading glasses, my blood pressure medication, my house keys, all of it. I had $17 in my jeans, a duffel bag with a week's worth of clothes, and a January wind coming off the Allegheny that went right through my flannel shirt like it wasn't there. I went inside because there was nothing else to do. The terminal was the kind of place that feels the same at any hour. Fluorescent lights and plastic seats and people who look like they've been waiting a long time for something that hasn't shown up yet. I fit right in. A security guard noticed me after about 40 minutes. Older gentleman, kind eyes, asked if I was waiting on a bus. I told him I was waiting on my daughter. He nodded. The way people nod when they suspect the truth is sadder than what you're saying. The truth came out in pieces, the way it does when you're too tired and cold and humiliated to keep constructing a better story. My daughter left me here. She has my coat, my phone, my wallet, everything. The guard's expression didn't change much, but something shifted behind his eyes. He told me that without a ticket, I couldn't stay in the terminal indefinitely, and that I should contact someone to come get me. I told him I didn't have a phone, and that most of the people I might call were either gone or scattered to places I hadn't kept up with since retirement, swallowed my routine whole. He walked me outside to a covered bench near the pickup area, the kind that had a little heat lamp overhead that wasn't quite keeping up with the weather. Told me someone from the station would check on me. Then he went back inside. I sat down and tried to think clearly. My brother lived in Columbus. My neighbor in Millvale had a spare key to my apartment, but I had no way to reach her. I had $17 and a duffel bag and a daughter who had just decided I was a problem she was done managing. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough to watch 2 buses come and go. Long enough to feel my fingers get stiff. Long enough to start thinking about the years I'd spent working double shifts so Lee could have the kind of childhood I never had. The piano lessons, the college fund, The car I co-signed for when she was 22. The down payment I quietly contributed to the Foxchapel house when they came up short at closing. Long enough to start understanding that none of it had bought me what I'd thought it would. "Excuse me." The voice came from my left. I turned to see an elderly woman lowering herself carefully onto the far end of the bench, one hand on the armrest, the other wrapped around a carved wooden cane. She was probably 75, maybe older, dressed in a long wool coat, the color of charcoal, white hair pulled back neatly, and the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of refusing to slouch. Her eyes were sharp and a little amused, like she was in on a joke no one else had heard yet. "You've been sitting there since before I got dropped off," she said. "And you haven't moved except to pull your jacket tighter." She wasn't wearing a jacket herself, just that coat, and she didn't look cold. "Are you all right?" I thought about lying. I'd been lying reflexively to that question for years, the way men my age do, fine, good, can't complain. But I was too tired for it. "No," I said. "Not particularly." She nodded, like that was exactly the right answer. "My name is Evelyn Marsh. I'm waiting for my driver. He's perpetually 15 minutes late, which is why I always arrive 20 minutes early." She said it without irritation, more like a fact she'd made peace with long ago. "And you?" "I'm Ray Cowell-chick," I told her. "I used to be a machinist. Now I'm apparently a man sitting on a bench in January with no phone and no way home." She looked at me directly when I said that, not with pity, which I appreciated, more like assessment. "How far is home?" "Millvale. 15-20 minutes north if there's no traffic. I've got $17, so that's most of a cab fare if the driver's feeling generous." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to make you an unusual proposal, Mr. Kowalczyk. You can say no, and I'll understand completely. But I think we might be useful to each other this morning." I looked at her. "I'm 67 years old," I said. "I stopped being surprised by unusual proposals about 30 years ago. Let's hear it." The faintest smile. "I need someone to ride with me to my home in Squirrel Hill. Not as a servant or a driver. My driver handles that. I need someone to walk into my house with me and be introduced as my nephew. My sister's son, visiting from out of town. Just for this afternoon. I have a meeting with my estate attorney and my financial manager, and I want to see how they behave when they think there's a new family member in the picture. In exchange, I'll see you home safely, replace whatever you lost, and give you $3,000 in cash." I stared at her. "You're serious?" "Entirely." She shifted her weight on the cane. "I'm an old woman with a complicated estate and a small circle of people who have been very attentive lately in ways that feel less like affection and more like calculation. I want to observe their behavior before I make some final decisions. You have an honest face. You look like someone who's worked hard and doesn't need to impress anyone." That's exactly what I need in the room. A black town car pulled to the curb, and a driver in a dark jacket stepped out. "Mrs. Marsh, ready when you are." Evelyn Marsh stood slowly with the careful dignity of someone who refused to let age look like weakness. She turned to me. "So, Mr. Kowalczyk, what do you say?" I looked at that car. I looked at the bench. I looked at the $17 in my pocket and thought about my daughter's taillights. "What do I have to call you?" I asked. "Aunt Evelyn will do fine." She extended her hand and I shook it. The drive to Squirrel Hill felt like crossing into a different city. I'd worked construction projects in neighborhoods like this years before the machinist job, renovating the kind of Victorian homes that the original owners had built to last a century. Evelyn's house was on a quiet street where the trees were old enough that their roots had started lifting the sidewalk. It was a 3-story brick house with a deep porch and original stained glass in the front windows. The kind of house that had absorbed 3 or 4 generations of a family and still had room for more. Her housekeeper, a compact woman named Doris, who appeared to be in her late 50s, opened the door before we'd even reached the top porch step. Her expression when she saw me was difficult to read. Professionally neutral on the surface, but something working underneath it. "Doris," Evelyn said pleasantly, "this is Ray, my sister Patricia's son. He's come down from Erie for a few days. Please make up the guest room." Doris's eyes moved from Evelyn to me and back. "Of course, Mrs. Marsh." She stepped aside. The interior was everything the exterior promised. Hardwood floors with genuine patina, not the fake distressed kind you see in renovation catalogues. Bookshelves built into the walls of the front room, floor to ceiling, with actual books that looked red, a fireplace in the sitting room with a mantel crowded with photographs. I found myself actually stopping to look at them, the way you do in a place that has real history. Evelyn watched me looking. "That's my husband Bernard," she said, pointing to a photograph of a man in his 40s, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. "He passed 11 years ago. We built the business together. Import and distribution, ceramic goods, industrial supply, not glamorous but honest." She said that last word the way I would have, like it meant something. "And your family?" I asked. "One daughter, Claudette. She lives in Seattle and calls on birthdays if she remembers." Evelyn said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. "I have a great nephew who visits, Dennis. He's been very devoted lately, which is what prompted this whole arrangement." She looked at me steadily. "Which is what prompted this whole arrangement." She looked at me steadily. "Dennis is not a bad person, but he has expensive habits and a belief that family loyalty entitles him to things he hasn't earned." We sat in the front room while Doris brought coffee. Evelyn told me the rest of it. Her estate attorney, a man named Clifford Pruitt, had been pushing her for 3 years to finalize a trust structure that would, she suspected, benefit certain parties more than herself. Her financial manager, a younger man named Wade something, had been similarly persistent. Dennis had recently started accompanying her to appointments, offering to help manage her affairs, which she found touching in the way you find a fox touching when it's admiring your henhouse. "I want to see how they behave when they think there's a blood relative paying attention," she said, "someone who might be positioned to contest or complicate their plans. Sometimes the only way to see a person clearly is to change the variables." "That's a deliberate way to go about it," I said. "I was an accountant for 40 years, Mr. Kowalczyk. I preferred data to intuition." She set down her cup. "There's something else I should tell you." I wasn't entirely straightforward at the bus station. My guard came up. "What do you mean?" "I didn't bring you here just for the experiment. I brought you here because you reminded me of Bernard." She said it simply, without sentimentality. He had that same look after his first business went under. Before we met, that particular combination of dignity and exhaustion that comes from someone who's been genuinely wronged and is trying not to let it defeat them. Bernard always said the most honest people he ever met were the ones who'd had everything taken from them and hadn't turned bitter. I looked out the front window at the quiet street. The January light was thin and pale and honest. "My daughter is ashamed of me," I said. "I don't know exactly when it happened, but she didn't want her in-laws to meet me. She decided it was easier to drop me at a bus station than explain me." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's her failure, not yours. But I suspect you already know that." I knew it, the way you know things that still hurt anyway. The attorney and the financial manager arrived together at 2 o'clock, which told me something by itself. Clifford Pruitt was 60-something, the kind of man who wore a suit on a Saturday like it was his natural skin. Wade Trenton was younger, mid-40s maybe, the kind of handsome that comes with too much time spent thinking about being handsome. Both of them stopped visibly when they saw me sitting in the front room with Evelyn. Clifford recovered first. "Evelyn, I wasn't aware we'd have company today." "Family," Evelyn said pleasantly. "Ray's Patricia's boy. He's come to visit for a few days." "Ray, this is my attorney, Clifford, and my financial advisor, Wade." I stood up and shook hands with both of them. "I'm a retired machinist, Tremere," I said, because I'd decided there was no point in pretending otherwise. I figured I'd let the truth do whatever it was going to do. The meeting that followed was the most uncomfortable 2 hours I'd spent in a long time, and I once sat through a 6-hour safety seminar conducted entirely in the passive voice. Clifford kept asking pointed questions about my mother, about our family history, about how long I'd be visiting. Evelyn deflected each one smoothly, citing old family complications, distances that had grown, recent reconnections. Wade, meanwhile, watched me the way a poker player watches someone who just sat down at the table with an unfamiliar tell. "So you're planning to be around for a while?" Wade asked at one point, addressing me directly. "Just visiting," I said. "Of course." He smiled in a way that didn't involve his eyes. "Still, it must be nice to reconnect with family at this stage of life." "It is," Evelyn said, before I could answer. "Family is exactly what I've been thinking about lately." After the meeting, while Clifford was gathering his papers in the dining room, Dennis arrived. He was about 40, roared through the shoulders with the energetic confidence of someone who'd been told his whole life that he was special. He stopped dead when he saw me. "Aunt Evelyn, who's this?" "This is Ray," Evelyn said. "My nephew, Patricia's son." Dennis looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the same one Thomas had worn in Robert Chen's dining room, though I didn't know that story yet. Pure calculation dressed up as family concern. "I didn't know Aunt Patricia had a son," he said carefully. "There are many things families don't know about each other," Evelyn said. "That's usually intentional." Dennis took me aside in the hallway about 10 minutes later, while Evelyn was talking to Clifford. He was perfectly pleasant about it, which somehow made it more unpleasant. "Look," he said, "I don't know what you and Aunt Evelyn have worked out, but I want you to know that I've been looking after her for 3 years. 3 years! I'm the one who drives her to appointments, checks on her when the weather's bad, deals with the house issues when something breaks." He paused. "I'd hate for any confusion to complicate her estate planning at this stage." "What kind of confusion?" I asked. He smiled. "The kind that comes from new people appearing in someone's life right before important decisions get made." "I'm her family," I said. "That's all." He nodded slowly. "Right." He walked away and I stood in that grand old hallway thinking about how I'd come here to play a role and somehow ended up in the same scene anyway. People protecting territory they'd decided was already theirs. Evelyn found me there. She took one look at my expression. "Dennis. Dennis." She sighed, not with surprise, just with the weight of knowing something you'd hoped wasn't true. "I thought so." She looked toward the dining room, where we could hear Clifford still shuffling papers. "I need to make some phone calls tonight, and I think I'd like company if you're willing to stay." I thought about my empty apartment. I thought about Lee's taillights. I thought about the fact that I had nowhere pressing to be and a daughter who'd made it clear she wasn't going to call. "One condition," I said. "No more pretending. I'm happy to be here as your guest, your friend, whatever this is. But I'm done with the nephew story. If Clifford or Wade or Dennis want to know who I am, they can ask me directly and I'll tell them the truth." Evelyn looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was a real one. "That's the most sensible thing anyone has said in this house in years. Deal." That first night, we sat in the front room after Doris had gone home, and Evelyn told me about Bernard, how they'd met at a trade show in Cleveland in 1974, both of them representing different companies, both of them tired and hungry and willing to share a table at the only restaurant still open near the convention center, how he'd asked her opinion on a business problem he was having and actually listened to her answer, how they'd spent the next 30 years building something together that neither of them could have built alone. "And Claudette?" I asked. Evelyn looked at the fire. "Claudette wanted a mother who stayed home. I was a woman who worked, and in 1985 in Pittsburgh those were still considered competing ambitions. We never quite forgave each other for what we each chose." She paused. "I tried to explain it to her when she was older." She listened politely. "But some distances, once they reach a certain width, you stop being able to shout across them. I told her about my wife, Donna, how we'd met at a Veterans of Foreign Wars dance in 1981 when I was 25 and still rough enough around the edges that I'm not entirely sure why she agreed to dance with me, how she'd made our little row house in Millvale into something that felt like the center of the world, how she'd been the one who always knew what to say to Lee, who understood the language of their relationship in a way I never quite managed, how everything shifted when Donna died 4 years ago, and how Lee and I had been slowly losing the thread ever since. She held the family together," I said, "not in a way I ever understood well enough to appreciate until she was gone." Evelyn reached over and covered my hand with hers briefly. "I know that feeling," she said. "Bernard was the same for different things. You don't always know what someone is doing until the doing stops." I stayed 3 days. Evelyn put me to work in the way that dignified people put guests to work, not with chores, but with purpose. She had boxes in the basement that needed organizing, decades of business records that were heading to a storage facility. She had opinions about how they should be sorted, and no one had bothered to ask her opinion in a while. So we worked together in the afternoons, talking while we sorted, building the kind of easy familiarity that usually takes years and occasionally happens in days. Doris came around the second morning. I caught her watching me with something that had shifted from suspicion to consideration. "You're not what I expected," she said, setting down a cup of coffee beside me. "What did you expect?" She shrugged. "Someone who wanted something." "I'm a retired machinist from Millvale," I said. "I don't have the energy for wanting things I can't carry." Gilmer smiled. "Mrs. Marsh seems lighter. That's not nothing." On the second evening, Clifford called. I could hear Evelyn's side of the conversation from the sitting room and the careful, practiced neutrality in his voice, even through the phone. She came back composed. "He wants to know my intentions regarding the estate timeline. He asked if my nephew's visit had any bearing on my planning." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that family always has a bearing on planning." She sat down. She looked satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with finally being clear-eyed. "I've decided to find a new attorney, one who was recommended to me by a friend from my accounting years, someone who doesn't know Dennis and has no prior investment in how my estate is structured. Clifford has been managing my affairs for a long time, and that's exactly the problem." Dennis showed up unannounced on the third morning. He'd clearly been hoping to catch Evelyn alone. His expression when he saw me at the breakfast table was the most honest I'd seen it. He pulled me aside in the hallway again, less pleasant this time. "You've been here 3 days. What exactly is your angle here?" "No angle," I said. "She needed company and I had time. People don't just spend 3 days with an elderly woman. They don't know out of the goodness of their hearts." "Maybe not," I said. "But I'm not people in general. I'm a specific person, and I'm telling you there's no angle." He didn't believe me. That was fine. The people who assume everyone has an angle are usually the ones who always have one themselves. Evelyn walked in from the kitchen and took in the scene with one look. "Dennis, if you have something to say it to me." He said several things: family loyalty, years of service, the sudden appearance of a stranger. His voice rose in a way that was supposed to sound righteous and instead sounded afraid. When he finished, Evelyn stood very still. "Dennis, your mother was my sister and I loved her. I've tried to honor that by being generous with you. But generosity isn't a debt, and helping me isn't the same as owning me." She said it quietly, which made it land harder. "Whatever I decide to do with my estate will be my decision. If you can't accept that, then I think you should go." He went, not before giving me one last look that promised this wasn't finished. But he went. Afterward, Evelyn sat down in the kitchen and looked tired in a way she hadn't shown before. I realized how much energy she'd been spending on all of it. The management of other people's expectations. The performance of being fine. "You should rest," I said. In a minute, she looked up at me. "I want to tell you something, Ray. I've made some decisions this week, and I want you to hear them from me directly." I told her the same thing I'd said about the nephew story. "If you're putting me in your will, I won't accept it." "That's not why I was here." "I know," she smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thing Bernard would have said." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not leaving you my house. This house is going to a historic preservation foundation. It's already in my original will and I'm not changing it, but I am putting aside a fund, $50,000, to help you establish something. Whatever that looks like for a retired machinist from Millvale who needs to rebuild from scratch." "Evelyn." I started to object. "Let me finish." She raised one finger. "It's not charity. It's one person recognizing another person's dignity at a moment when it needed recognizing. That's all. Bernard did that for me once when my first employer tried to push me out and I had nothing. Someone saw me clearly and helped me stand back up. I'm old enough now to understand that the point of being helped is eventually helping someone else." I sat with that for a moment. The January light was coming through the kitchen window and landing on the old wooden table between us, and I thought about Donna, who would have liked this woman immediately. "There are conditions," Evelyn continued. "You have to do something with it, not save it, not let it sit. Something that matters to you." She paused. "And you have to call your daughter." I looked at her. "That one's harder." "I know." She stood slowly, reaching for her cane. "The hard ones are usually the ones worth doing." My phone rang that evening. I'd been using a prepaid one Evelyn had her driver pick up for me the first day. The number was one I didn't recognize but answered anyway because at 67 you stop worrying as much about who's calling. "Dad." Lee's voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Dad, is it you?" "It's me." A long silence. "I've been trying to find you. I called the Pittsburgh bus station. I called Millvale General Hospital. I even called Uncle Pete in Columbus because I didn't know where else to try." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Dad, I am so sorry. I know that's not enough. I know it." I sat in Evelyn's sitting room and looked at the fire and let the silence go on a little longer than necessary. Not to punish her, just because I needed a moment to find the right version of what I actually felt, which was tired and sad and still, underneath everything. Her father. "Why, Lee?" I asked. "Just tell me why." "Because Kurt's parents think. They think Dad, the way she said it, told me what was coming. They think you're not good enough for their family. And I've spent 2 years trying to make them see you differently instead of just telling them they're wrong." She was crying now. "I was so afraid of what they'd think that I stopped thinking about what I was doing. And what I did was terrible. I left my father at a bus station in January. I'm a terrible person." "You're not a terrible person," I said, and I meant it, even though I was also furious. "You made a terrible choice." "Those are different things." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Can I come get you?" "Please, just tell me where you are." I told her I was with a friend and that I wasn't ready yet. I told her I needed a few more days to figure out how to be in the same room with her without either of us saying things we couldn't unsay. I told her that whatever she thought about managing her in-laws' opinions, she needed to decide who her father was to her. Not to them, to her. And that until she figured that out, all the apologies in the world were just words. "I love you, Dad," she said. "I know you do," I told her. "That's what makes it complicated." I stayed one more day. On the last morning, Evelyn and I had breakfast, and she told me about the new attorney she'd engaged, a woman named Patricia Osei, who came recommended by 3 people Evelyn trusted, and about the revised plans for her estate that felt, for the first time, like her actual wishes, instead of a negotiated compromise. She seemed lighter, the way Doris had described it. Before her driver came to take me back to Millvale, Evelyn gave me an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check and a handwritten note that said only, "For the next chapter." Do something honest with it. I held the envelope and thought about what honest looked like for a 67-year-old retired machinist with a broken relationship with his daughter, an empty apartment, and a life that had narrowed considerably since retirement. Then I thought about what Evelyn had said. Someone saw me clearly and helped me stand back up. The point of being helped is eventually helping someone else. I had an idea. Leigh came to see me 2 weeks after I got back to Millvale. She sat at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee and said most of what needed to be said. And I said some of what needed to be said, and neither of us said the rest of it, because some things take more than one conversation to work through. But we were in the same room. Her eyes kept going to the window the way they used to when she was young and processing something difficult. I recognized that. Donna had the same habit. I told her about Evelyn, about what had happened, and what it had taught me and what I was planning to do. Leigh listened all the way through, which she doesn't always do, and when I finished, her eyes were wet. "She saw you," Leigh said quietly. "A stranger saw who you were." "Yeah," I said. "She did." Leigh looked down at her coffee. "I'm going to spend a long time making this right, Dad. However long it takes." "So will I told her. "That's kind of the deal with families." I used part of Evelyn's gift to put a deposit on a small commercial space in Millvale, a former auto parts shop with a big garage bay and enough room in the back for a decent workshop. I'd spent 30 years working on other people's machines. I knew machines. I knew how to fix things that were broken and restore things that people had written off. I started with small engine repair, lawn mowers and generators and the occasional motorcycle, the kind of work that fills up a neighborhood once word gets around that someone's doing it right. But the other part of the space, the back room with the high ceilings and good light, I kept for something else. I set up a workbench and sourced some used equipment and put a flyer on the bulletin board of the Millvale Community Center. Free machining and fabrication classes. Saturday mornings, no experience necessary. Just bring your hands and a willingness to learn. Evelyn called me every few weeks. We talk the way people talk when they've known each other a long time, which we hadn't, but which is a thing that can happen faster than logic suggests when you meet someone who sees you clearly. She told me about the new attorney and the progress on her revised estate. She told me that Dennis had, after a period of difficult silence, eventually called to apologize, and that she'd accepted it because she believed he was genuinely ashamed rather than just recalculating. She told me that Claudette had come to visit in March for the first time in 4 years, and that it had been awkward and painful, and also, unexpectedly, hopeful. "People can surprise you," she said once on the phone in early spring. "Even the ones who've been disappointing you for a long time." Evelyn passed away in late September, about 8 months after we met. Peacefully in her own home, which was what she'd wanted. Doris called me. The house was given to the Preservation Foundation as planned. The new will held up without contest because Clifford Pruitt, when faced with a revised document prepared by a different attorney, had no grounds to challenge. And Dennis, true to the apology Evelyn had described, did not pursue legal action. I drove to Squirrel Hill for the memorial. It was a small gathering, a handful of old colleagues from her accounting years, the foundation representatives Doris, Claudette, who looked like a mother around the eyes. Claudette found me afterward and said, "She mentioned you more than once. She said you reminded her of my father." She said it like she meant it as a compliment, which I understood to be the highest one she had available. I still have Evelyn's note. For the next chapter. Do something honest with it. I taped it to the inside of the workshop door where I can see it when I'm locking up at night. The Saturday classes have been running for 2 years now. I've had 30-some people come through, teenagers mostly. A few adults who got laid off from manufacturing jobs and needed somewhere to put their hands. A few of them are still coming regularly. One kid, 17, showed up last fall with no mechanical experience, and an aptitude that reminded me of myself at that age, the way certain work just makes sense to you from the first moment you try it. I've been helping him put together a portfolio. I think he could get an apprenticeship if someone writes the right letter. The shop is small and the margins are thin, and some months I'm glad I have a pension to fall back on. But when I lock up on a Saturday afternoon and there are coffee cups on the workbench and sawdust on the floor, and a kid who's figured out how to true a lathe for the first time, I feel something that I didn't feel for a long time after Donna died, after retirement took away the structure that had been holding everything in place, after Lee drove away from that bus station, and I sat on a cold bench in January wondering what I was worth to anyone. I feel like I know exactly what I'm doing there and exactly why it matters. I went back to Pittsburgh last January, the anniversary of it more or less. I drove past the transportation center on Liberty Avenue without stopping, just to see it, the way you sometimes need to see a place where something difficult happened in order to understand that you're no longer that person sitting in it. Then I drove to Squirrel Hill, parked in front of Evelyn's house, and sat for a while looking at the stained glass in the front windows. The Preservation Foundation had done good work. The porch had been refinished. The garden was better tended than it had been when I was there. The house looked like what Evelyn had wanted it to be, something that would last. I thought about what she'd said that first morning, sitting on that cold bench. Sometimes the most honest people are the ones who've had everything taken from them and haven't turned bitter. I don't know if I've managed that entirely. There are still days when I think about Lee's taillights and feel something that's harder than sadness, but I keep working at it. The way you work at anything that matters, steadily, without expecting it to be easy, with the understanding that the point isn't perfection, but continuation. Lee brings Emmett to the shop sometimes on Saturday mornings now. He's 7, and last month he stood at the workbench for 40 minutes helping me sand a wooden handle for a hand plane, focused in the particular way that children get when something is real and they know it. Leigh stood in the doorway watching us, and when I looked up she had an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years, something uncomplicated and unguarded, the way she used to look when she was small and the world was still mostly made up of things her father could fix. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. Some things don't need words, especially between people who are slowly, imperfectly learning how to be what they were always supposed to be to each other. That's what Evelyn gave me. Not the money, though the money mattered. Not the shelter, though the shelter helped. She gave me back the thread, the one I'd lost somewhere between Donna's funeral and that January morning. The thread that connects who you were to who you're still capable of being. An old woman with a carved cane and sharp eyes, and no patience for people who saw her as a transaction, sat down on a bench next to a man with $17 and a daughter who'd driven away, and she looked at him like he was worth looking at. That's the thing about kindness, when it comes from someone who doesn't have to give it. It doesn't just help you through the moment. It changes the shape of the moments that come after. I've thought a lot about what it actually means to earn something. Not in the financial sense, not a paycheck or a pension, but to earn the right to be seen clearly by another person. That's what happened to me on a cold bench outside a Pittsburgh bus station, and I still don't entirely understand why Evelyn Marsh stopped to ask if I was all right. She didn't have to. Most people walked past without slowing down, but she stopped, and because she stopped, everything that came after became possible. What I've come to believe is that the way things unfolded wasn't random. Lee made a choice rooted in fear and shame, and that choice had consequences she didn't anticipate. Not punishment handed down from somewhere above, just the natural weight of what we do to the people who love us. When you treat someone as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be honored, you don't just hurt them. You diminish yourself. You become smaller than you were. Lee knew it. That's why her voice cracked when she called. She wasn't afraid of losing an inheritance. She was afraid of having become someone her mother wouldn't recognize. And Evelyn, for her part, had spent years surrounded by people who were watching her balance sheet instead of her face. Dennis wasn't evil. He just let comfort and expectation do the slow work of replacing genuine feeling. That's one of the quieter ways people go wrong. They stop asking what's right and start asking what they're owed. Evelyn saw it clearly because she was a woman who had spent 40 years in accounting and knew the difference between a real number and a manipulated one. What I carry from all of it is this. The moment I stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't, something shifted. Not just in that house in Squirrel Hill, but in myself. I'd spent years softening the edges of who I was to make Lee more comfortable, wearing different clothes, choosing different words, quietly apologizing for the way I'd built my life with my hands instead of a briefcase. And none of it had worked, because you can't negotiate your way into being loved for who you actually are. You can only stand still long enough for someone with clear eyes to find you. That's what takes real steadiness. Not toughness, not anger, but the willingness to remain yourself when everything around you is suggesting you shouldn't be. Evelyn had it. She sat in that house with people pulling at her estate from every direction, and she stayed exactly who she was, clear-headed, direct, unhurried. She didn't harden. She just refused to be moved by the wrong things. And the shop, the Saturday mornings, the kid who's learning to true a lathe, that came directly from understanding that you don't hold on to what you've been given. You pass it forward. That's not a philosophy I read somewhere. It's what Evelyn did for me. What she said Bernard once did for her. And what I now understand is the only honest response to being helped when you needed it. You look for the next person on the bench. You sit down. You ask if they're all right. Emmett is 7 now, and last week he asked me how buildings don't fall down. I told him it's because the people who built them took their time and did it right. He thought about that for a second, and then asked if we could build something. We started on a birdhouse. It's crooked and probably structurally ambitious for a 7-year-old, but he's been thinking about it every day since. That's enough. That's exactly enough.